We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
My name is Oz Davis, and this is Truly the Goats, sports history as told through its superstars.
For episode 12 of Truly the Goats, we had on the show Emmet Ryan, a journalist, sports writer, and an old compadre of mine from my days covering European basketball. The idea was to talk some star dual players of the Irish national sports of hurling and Gaelic football. And we did, but we also managed to talk around the entire sports world in about 45 minutes or so, at least touching on American football, Canadian football, rugby, boxing, cricket, baseball, sumo, fencing, and of course, basketball. Plus, a Brian Scalabrine name drop. Following is the entire unexpurgated conversation, romping free in the stream of consciousness, sports style. Enjoy. Emmet Ryan, thanks for joining us on Truly the Goats.
It's great to be on, Oz. It's been a while since we talked as well. It's the first time I'm talking to you properly during the pandemic. I can say that, but yeah, it's it's wild. And it's great to be talking about sports I used to play as a young guy as well. Mm-hmm. I was a much younger man than I am now, for sure.
Mm-hmm. How central are sports, and especially the Gaelic sports, to Irish culture in the 21st century?
Oh, they're still huge. Sport as a whole, I think was definitely much grander in terms of Irish culture than just our own sports. But the championship season, what we basically would call a playoff, so to speak, although it's a little bit more complex than that, that sort of captures the general attitude of the audience around here through the summer months into sort of September when the finals are on. And yeah, it's so that'd be the key time, but it's rooted a lot into communities as well. So the smaller clubs, which sort of would feed into the larger county teams, they're key parts of most rural communities and pretty important in urban communities in very different ways, oddly, now than they would have been historically. But that being said, while as individual sports they're both huge, the biggest participation sport remains soccer. That's obviously a lot of sort of the British/European influence. And the biggest draw, even though they're terrible at the moment, is still the national soccer team. And I mean, they've been bad for a while, Oz. I don't think anyone who is sort of is recalling sort of great Irish teams of the last couple of years. You might recall teams, if you're listening, from about 20 years ago, but not so much of recent years. And that's not an accident. And obviously rugby's also huge here. Again, that'd be a lot of the UK influence, and we've generally been better at that. Although that it does help that far fewer countries play it. But I suppose the curious thing is for domestic sports, because they are really, while there are GA clubs all over the world, and we are seeing more people who aren't Irish play it overseas. Obviously, plenty of people who aren't Irish play it in Ireland, when they come here. But sort of it's still so overwhelmingly dominated by sort of players within Ireland, comfortably the majority, and then some of players worldwide live within the island of Ireland. And so, yeah, it's kind of unusual sort of, that they remain sort of so high in terms of the national consciousness compared to when you think of other countries that are not at the scale of, say, the US. Obviously, people go, well, the NFL's pretty much its biggest place is the US. Yeah, but the US is whatever. It's 400 million people. It's a bit different to 4 or 5 million people, which is what we are. If you include the whole island, it's closer to 7 or 8, because obviously the games are played in both Northern Ireland and Republic. But it's kind of rare that you have sports hold that level of prestige when they don't really have much international cachet as such.
Right. Very, very many cultures create unique sports. But there are sports exporters, and then there are sports importers. It tends to be. Like, again, if you think about something like sumo, of course, nowadays sumo is drawing people from all over the world. I mean, they had a couple of Hungarian guys, at the highest level last I looked. So it's getting to be out there everywhere. But in general, I mean, this is a 500, 600, 700-year-old sport. We're just talking organized, and only now is it getting out there, and it's only getting out there now because of this sort of neoliberal internationalism. But for example, let's just get into hurling. Hurling is, as far as I can tell, one of the oldest continuous sports in the world, and yet it has traveled nowhere. But let me ask you this, just to put it simply. Emmet, what the hell is hurling? Can you explain it to me simply?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by stealing a line from Jason Statham in a movie he did called Blitz. He described it as a cross between hockey, as in field hockey, and murder. Which, I thought was a wonderful description. Basically, you got a field, it's about, I'm doing a quick math here, sorry. It's about 150 yards long, about 140 meters long in total. So, and it's about another, I've actually forgotten the width, but it's about 1.5 times the width of a football field is the best way to describe the width. And so it's a really big field. You got 15 players in each team, and you're basically got this really small ball, about, again, trying to even think of sort of the size. It'd be sort of, if you rounded out a hockey puck, I suppose, trying to think of sort of comparisons where y'all are.
Well, like lacrosse, right? It's basically a lacrosse ball, isn't it?
Yeah, very similar in size. But the difference is, you get to handle this ball, like so, and you hit it with a stick, which is about, a foot, just over a foot long. And sorry, just over 3 feet long. My apologies, I forgot how big. Just over 3 feet long, like 3.5 feet, and you whack it really hard, and you try and either score a point, which is over a crossbar, or a goal, which is into a goal, which is very similar to a soccer net, only slightly smaller, and in terms of the net size, but substantially bigger than, say, an ice hockey net, and and so you're trying to do that, and there is basically no padding. Helmets have become mandatory in recent years, but that was because of eye injuries, which were oddly not to do with the pace of play, but more sort of inadvertent movement, if that makes sense, because you're holding big sticks and like there's a ball going about, and guys might get eye injuries. And so people might immediately assume, well, it's going really fast and all that. It's like, yeah, the speed and the power is actually far less of a risk to the eye, which is still a risk, than sort of inadvertent movements of elbows and stuff, which was sort of why helmets are basically brought in. And so, like, I'm 40 now, and I grew up always wearing a helmet, but helmets didn't become mandatory until about, I think we're talking 10 years ago. So we're talking, most of my life, it wasn't mandatory to wear a helmet in the sport. So it's interesting in that respect, but it's very, very fast, and it's a nightmare to watch on television at times because the speed of the play, because you're talking like guys are hitting this ball at like 60 miles an hour on an enormous pitch. That keeping up with it, it's much harder to watch on TV than it is in person, which is, I suppose, one of the things that's hurt its export potential, but there's a lot more to it than that.
So the live experience is better.
Oh, by far. Like, so Croke Park, which would be our national stadium, it's like, it takes 82,500 people. So it's upper deck. If like, I've actually got my ideal spot, like, so it's basically midfield upper deck is where I want to be. Cause it's like, it's not so much about being close to the field, which I have done. I've had like pitch side seats, which sounds amazing. And you realize, yeah, but you can't tell anything that's going on is the problem when you're pitch side, and even sort of your premium corporate seats, they're good, but actually a little bit higher than them is genuinely a better view, even though they're the same pro price seats as sort of, you would be getting at sort of the lower tiers. So it's interesting in that respect. But yeah, I played this as a kid, and Oz knows that I'm the most athletic guy going. So it's a physical sport is what I will say as well. Like, there's a lot of bashing about, like, you hit the ball on the ground or with your hands, and, so long as, you're not deliberately going for the guy's leg, if the guy happens to get hurt in the process of you swinging, it's considered fair play. Like, most of the worst injuries in hurling are not attempts at fouls. Like, it's like, I remember explaining to people, who, and I suppose it's people now, it's like, it's a sport which is violent by nature, as in, there is dirtiness, there are people who try to be dirty in it, but honestly, if you really want to hurt somebody, don't try, you're just going to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what they always say. If you're doing something like fencing or American football, it's most dangerous when you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, I played offensive line American football, and all my worst injuries were total fluke accidents by far. Like, there was, Largely involved a fat person, often a fat person on my team landing on my ankle. So not the same fat person, I will say. Like, it was different fat guys every time. But the downside of playing offensive line is you're all fat guys. And so the risk to your ankles is huge.
Yeah, fat guys who can't handle a ball.
Exactly.
Glad you brought that up about seeing it live, because I wanted to ask you this. It is said that one of the great sporting events in the world is the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship. What is it about this competition that is so great?
Well, the obvious thing is the best in sport doing it. But again, you're talking like guys who, like, they're playing a sport I'd have played as a kid. But when I'm saying they're doing stuff I couldn't imagine doing, like when I say played American football, I know I am as good as sort of, the best offensive lineman, but I can understand everything that guy is doing when I'm watching it slow down and replay.
Right.
And I can imagine me being able to mimic it at a slowed down pace, if that makes sense. Like with hurling, sort of the speed they're able to twist, turn, move that ball at, I'm kind of going, never would have been able to do that. And I played hurling a lot longer than I played American football. And it's like, it's just the speed they're able to move at, like sort of being able to turn a dime, and you don't even see how they're getting the power in their swing, and they're still like whacking a ball 80 yards at like 40 to 70 miles an hour, depending on what way they're whacking it. And it's the speed at which things move, because it's typically a high scoring sport. Like in terms of scoring events in a game, you're talking like, in a good game, it's like comfortably north of 40 for scoring events. Like in a good game, like that's, and it's a 70-minute match, like so. But you'll get games where it'll be up to like 60 of high end matches. Like you can get some absolutely ludicrously high scoring games. Like there's different forms of scoring, obviously. Like like there was but the two are basically a goal and a point. They're the only ones that matter. So it's like a goal is worth 3 points, and you add it all up at the end, and the team with the most points wins. So it's 70 minutes, 35 aside, and it's like, it's like most European sports. There's no timeouts, there's no, water breaks, there's nothing like that. We actually brought in water breaks this year entirely because of COVID, because we weren't allowed to bring. That was entirely purely in order to make sure that everybody drank from their bottle, if that makes sense, because obviously you couldn't be rushing water in during the game. Yeah. And so that was entirely a COVID measure to make sure that people weren't sharing bottles. Like that's the only reason water breaks were brought in this year. So
do you think that's going to stay?
No, to be honest. I don't think. I think most people like the lack of stopping. It's like, it's just so high paced, so crazy. But it's like a lot of codified sports. If you actually go back to sort of, because if you think about most of the sports we follow, like the first championships in them weren't until towards the end of the 19th century, like soccer, 19th century, like, Gaelic football and hurling are the same. They were codified formally as in the games. Well, I say the games as today, they've always been changed a lot since then. But in 1884, in both those cases, and the first championships weren't until 1887, even though both sports have been played for a long time before that. Like there's like lots of stories of hurling and Irish legends. And rugby didn't get invented till the mid 1800s. Obviously American football, you're talking like 19th century as well. Like pretty much every sport you and I follow that isn't horse racing or track and field, by and large, like, it isn't an ancient Olympic game, basically. It wasn't codified until the 19th century, sort of when there became this sort of rush to do it.
Right. Yeah, you're jumping my gun a little bit here, because I wanted to talk to you about that, especially with regard to Gaelic football. But let me get in on this, because we've been dancing around this, and I'm really anxious to talk about it. You promised me before the show that we could talk about some myth. Hurling appears to be one of the few sports that actually appears in myth, aside from the actual Greeks, who some folks believe that the first 10 Olympics were played among the gods. They had that when they actually had the first Olympics. That was the 11th one. So hurling kind of compares with that in Ireland. But okay, so can you tell me some myths, and can you tell me like how prevalent these are? Are we going to talk about Finn McCool?
Close. Cuchulainn, who's from sort of same era of mythology, like is the big one. So Cuchulainn, which means the Hound of Cullen, and it's sort of how he got his name. So he's sort of Ireland's greatest ever warrior, and how he got his name derives from hurling, basically. So he had just played a hurling match while on the way to a party this guy Cullen was having. The problem was he was really, really good at hurling, so it was him against an entire team of guys. It's never listed how many in the story, but like, a modern team is 15. It's widely assumed teams back then were like 18 to 30 or something crazy like that, and he beat them all on his own. But obviously there was no time limits back then, so he just took however long it was for everybody to be convinced, yeah, Cuchulainn totally beat us as a team. He's amazing. But he's late to the party, and all he's got is his hurley and his slitter, which was the ball is called. And the problem was Cullen just assumed, well, Cullen isn't coming, so I better leave the guard dog out in case, any neighbouring tribe comes along to try and raid this party and kill a bunch of people. So the dog's outside. Cuchulainn has no idea. He's just rocking up late to this party. And dog comes for him, man. Cuchulainn's got, the only weapons he has are, the sliotar, the ball, and a stick. So he whacks the ball as hard as he can, as fast as he can at the dog, hits it in the temple, dog falls stone dead. And, Cullen comes out and is like, well, it's great you're alive, but damn, my dog's dead, this is a really good dog. I kept my house safe forever. And Cullen goes, I got this. I will be your hound until such time as you don't need me. And so that's how he became Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cullen. He's sort of mythologically sort of the biggest mention towards his hurling comfortably. It's one every Irish kid would have heard growing up. And you always associate Cuchulainn with hurling. He ended up being in sort of the Cooley saga, which is sort of about basically about capitalism and feudalism. So the Queen of Connacht, which was one of the ancient provinces, it still is a province in Ireland now. Her and her husband measured her wealth, and it worked out that he had one bull more than her, and that made him richer, and she was annoyed. So she went all the way to the east coast to a place called Cooley and wanted to steal the brown bull of it. And the guy who owned it said, nah, this is my bull, I'm not stealing it. So Cuchulainn, as an Ulster guy, which is Cooley was part of that province, basically fought off like mad. And eventually he fell, but, so Maeve won, but it ended up being a fair victory because things didn't go well for Maeve after that. But again, it's a whole lot of Cuchulainn, noble sacrifice, but kills a hilarious number of people in the defense, but just isn't good enough in the end. And, absolute, total, Ireland's greatest hero in that respect, even though it's all pretty much internal warfare when you think about it.
So the national championship is played among county teams. Is the structure similar to the club structure in Europe?
You can only play for the county you're from, although, right. People will actually often go on a parent or granny rule or residency rule. So the classic one is there's lots of people who work as teachers. This is an amateur sport is a key thing, which we haven't mentioned, of course. Nobody's paid to play. There is some support for training expenses, there's grants, but they aren't exactly great. Now you can still make endorsement deals on the side, but no one's getting rich from playing the sport, But the classic one is if you reside there and it's clearly your home, you go to a regional board and they'll quickly approve if it's obvious you're not trying to take the mick, there's only a certain window in the year you're allowed to do it, but it's usually a fait accompli unless you're being blatant. And the story with that is typically people move for work. So, you can play either where you're from or where you live as a typical rule. There's the odd person who's played for a county of parents and stuff, but that was typically because their parents just really did not want them to play for the county they lived in. They wanted them to play for their county, you know what I mean? And again, nobody really argues that because there has been the odd county that's tried to go ridiculous over the years, but it's never really worked out for them. And so no one gets too fussed about it is the best way to describe it. So it's typically where you're from or where you reside. So yeah, county teams are selected from the club teams basically within that county or within the players eligible, and it's the whole sort of core root of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the GAA, which is sort of governs hurling and Gaelic football, is sort of the club first and then the county. So that's led to a lot of sort of arguments because obviously the county draws in more money and gets more TV time, but yeah, hurling is a bit smaller than Gaelic football, which I'm sure we're going to get to. But so there's only about 8 or 9 counties that were seen in any given year as being sort of in the top tier in hurling, as in good enough to play in the top tier, not necessarily with a chance of winning out of 32 who compete. And so you typically only have 10 teams playing in the top tier competition every year, and there'd be 3 tiers below that. So whereas in Gaelic football, the way it works is every county gets a go in the top tier because no one's so weak that even though there are some hilariously lopsided beatings, no one's so weak yet that they've felt the need to grade it out so much.
All right, let's shift gears into Gaelic football. Is there promotion and relegation?
No, but there's coming. So there is a league as well, but that sort of doesn't have any impact on the championship, which is the main summer competition that everybody cares about. So the league is sort of more seen as the spring competition. So there are 4 divisions of 8 in that, and that's standard 2 up, 2 down. With a final in each division every year, which doesn't affect promotion or relegation. It's just people like to get a trophy.
Right.
So that decides the divisional champion or the overall league champion in case of the top division. But with hurling, there is promotion and relegation for sure. With football, it's sort of coming in that, so it's going to get graded where I think it's teams who actually it will be influenced by the leagues where your league position will affect where you can enter the championship. And basically some teams, at the moment it's not like this, will only be able to enter in sort of the secondary competition going forward, but will have an opportunity to go up and vice versa. The problem essentially is that sort of it's gotten so top heavy now. Like Dublin have dominated the championship in recent years. To where I'm from, my county, it's great, but they've won the last 6 titles straight, which is unprecedented dominance in the history of the sport. No one had done more than 4 in a row before. That had only been done 3 times ever in the 130 years of 30 plus years. And 5 in a row have been, famously was the closest it ever came was like in 1982 when a last minute goal changed it. But like you go forward 40 years and Dublin are now on 6 and our favourites do 7. But even below them, because even if you got rid of Dublin, the problem is your next 2 or 3 counties are so far above pretty much everybody else that the goals are getting just too big. And the smaller counties are finding it harder and harder to compete. As a result, people are kind of arguing that, well, we need to make the summer matter more to the smaller counties or the counties for whom, say, hurling is bigger, Gaelic football isn't. So we need to give them reasons to still care about football longer. So it's kind of gotten interesting in that respect. Like I would have grown up and Dublin would have had a fight even in their province, so there's 4 provinces in their region to win the championship. They'd been favourites most years, but there were years they wouldn't be, and there'd be years sort of where they'd go out early even in the provincial stage, so they might have a very early summer. Whereas I have just turned 40 Oz. I have never in my entire 30s, Dublin did not lose a single game in their region, in their province, basically. So that's like of Ireland. That's comfortably unprecedented. I can tell you, that didn't happen, and so they that was one of those ones where it's kind of going, yay, great. It's like for me, it's on the one hand as a fan, it's like my team wins a lot, but the other side, you need competition, you need a reason to care. And I even noticed, when Dublin, say, won in 2011, it was their first win in 16 years. That was one of the wildest parties I've ever been at. When we went one sort of in I suppose what year would have been, I'm trying to do the math back. You had 2014 sort of beat Kerry in a final. That was big because beat Kerry in a final. But then sort of it started to lose its luster. And even the 4 in a row was like, yeah, we've matched it. And it was only when we hit 5 in a row that the party got big again, because again, Dublin had finally beaten a record that they had that somebody else held. And so that was a big deal. And I've got to do the math on it. I think it's still about 4 or 5 titles difference. It's only the next championship I could see being that big for Dublin to win will be when they get the overall lead, which is held by Kerry. They're the perennial powers. But Dublin won last year, obviously in front of nobody, and there was no fear of people breaking COVID rules for it. Not because we're so good, but because it's just a 6th title. Whereas you get a county like Mayo, which has lost I think 7 finals in my lifetime, maybe 8 now, which is crazy. They haven't won it since 1951. They've been to the final 6-7 times, and they forced replays a couple of times. They're if they win, that county is just going to be a complete and you're talking county. It's about 100,000 people I think live in Mayo. I could be way off. I could be a bit low there, but that county is just going to be a disaster for the next month afterwards when they finally break their curse.
So it kind of sounds to me like it's falling prey to what happens in North American leagues, what happens in European soccer and basketball leagues, where 1 or 2 teams win it every year. In Greece, it's Olympiacos and Panathinaikos every year, right? Yeah. In Israel, it's Maccabi Tel Aviv forever and always, right? So it almost feels like that. It's unfortunate that there's no outlet. There is no EuroLeague. There is no Champions League for Gaelic football. So.
Yeah, and I think back even the 90s, because there was always the problem, Kerry were always powerful, but the 90s, both Kerry were weak and Dublin were good, but not great. So Dublin won 1 title in the 90s, Kerry won 1 title in the 90s. And Kerry's at the very end, it was 98, 97 they won it. And actually they might have won 99 as well. I'd be a bit harsh on them. But they the 2 dominant powers only won 3 of the 10 titles that decade, and as a result, it was way more spread out. It was way more interesting. It was way more competitive. Right. You had a couple of counties win their first ever. You had one county that hadn't won in 30 years or 20 years come back to win 2 titles. And you had a couple of other counties win actually another county which hadn't won in 30 years. So you had 2 counties with first evers, 2 with huge long gaps. A couple of the perennials. So you had the nice mix of, your power teams are still good, but everybody else is sort of, rising as well. So you had this sort of period where lots of teams got better, and that carried on until the early 2000s, where you had another couple of maiden victories. And really even sort of through 2010, I suppose, when you had sort of become sort of two counties were dominating, but Dublin wasn't one of them. It was Tyrone and Kerry. Tyrone sort of in the north and Kerry's in the south, for those who don't know Irish geography. But like, you know, it was still, you had a lot more counties who were in the mix every year. And it's only really since, I hate to admit, like, that my county Dublin has sort of dominated, that it's become kind of hard to care. Because, you know, for me as a Dublin fan, I watch now just hoping to not lose to Mayo. Like, the key thing is to not be they break the curse against, because that would be the great shame. And it's even ridiculous to be talking about it that way, you know. And so, I remember watching the final. It was because you mentioned basketball. I was at Eurobasket 2017, the last Eurobasket we've had so far, and I was at the final. And but I knew that the Gaelic football final was on the same day, and I had made my peace that I wasn't going to make it to be in Ireland for watching Dublin in the final. I'd made my peace with that before I went out, and so it's the morning of Slovenia Serbia. Well, it's the afternoon because the game's in the evening. And so I'm the only journalist who's not Slovene or Serb or one of FIBA's own staff who's already in the building this year. And so I've got the laptop open, and of course I've been the one calm guy throughout the tournament because I'm one of the few journalists who hasn't got a rooting interest. And they're suddenly seeing me start to lose it in the last 5 minutes of this game. And it was, but like, I wouldn't describe the feeling as joy. Like, it was relief. It was relief. It was weird. Because, like, had you, 5 years earlier when Dublin won their first in 16 years, like, my first as an adult, like, it was like, oh, yeah, like, greatest party of my life. 5 years later, like, I'm still a young enough dude, like, and I'm still in the same part of my life, so to speak, life-wise. It's the feeling isn't so much joy as sheer relief that we won. Right. It's that's weird, like, because people go, oh, boo-hoo, you're winning. It's like, no, man, I want sports to be interesting, like, and like, it's great that, we got the record and all that, but Jenny, I just wish it was, less predictable we were going to win.
Oh, my God. You sound like a goddamn New England Patriots fan, man.
I thought you were going to say LA Lakers fan for a second. But
okay. No way. I'm not, I wouldn't disparage a Lakers fan.
Well, if it's any comfort, I hate the Patriots.
Well, they're less hateable now. All right, let's see. Okay, so we talked about this before. Gaelic football goes back to the late 1880s, 1887 to be exact. This is a time period when, of course, soccer or association football is kind of breaking off. It's evolving into these different sports. Rugby, you have, association football is codified. You have American football starting to distinguish itself. Even Canadian football is developing a variant. What makes Gaelic football? Like, what distinguishes it from rugby, especially in American football?
Well, it's got two things in common with hurling, which come in handy. First off, the pitch is the exact same size.
Right.
And actually three things. The scoring is identical. And the number of players is the same. It's 15 aside, which I've always assumed was a practical thing because, like, the same people ran both sports, so they figured use the same pitches and the same scoring.
Right. Same players.
It's like, so it's 15 players aside, like, and again, you got goals, you got points, and a goal is worth 3 of those. It was at one point a goal was worth like infinite points, then it was reduced to 5, then it was reduced to 3, and that was like over a century ago, and we still got 3 for over a century now. There was a point where like a goal was infinite points, which, basically just led to goalkeepers getting like battered over the line because, but again, it's a very physical game, so the idea is sort of, you can kick the ball with your feet or with your hands, from your hands. Most people will aim to do it with their hands. You can pass the ball with sort of, a closed fist or an open hand, but it's got to be a striking action, so you can't throw it like a basketball is what I'm trying to say. And the idea is to, get the ball up the field to score in your opponent's end. And the idea obviously is like, sort of that's very hard because most teams are really good at defending and stopping you getting there. So that would be a much lower scoring event game than hurling. It would still have a lot of scoring events, but say the weather actually has a huge impact on scoring events in Gaelic football compared to hurling. So in hurling, you'll still have crazy high scores, by and large, unless the weather is utterly abysmal. Like we know as a Gaelic football, sort of, bit of rain and even like a harder pitch, it'll drop it. So like, good Gaelic football match will have about 30 to 35 scoring events. But in the winter, a game could be great and it still might only have 25 scoring events. Just because, like, it's just so much harder to move that ball. Also the elements, frankly, affect the ball more when it's being kicked in the air, because, it's going at a slower speed. So it's not like, dealing with the wind as well as say a sliver was. So that's a huge impact. But the idea is sort of you can't just like run with it like a rugby ball. So you've got to, like, every 4 steps, you've got to either bounce it or you got to, hop it on your foot. And naturally, people can do things to you while this is the case. So you try to like move the ball from player to player more than do that. Although some guys, if you get open field, you're just going to run and try and do that. And yeah, like I played that as a kid. I suppose it was kind of weird in that I was a better player at hurling, but I understood football better. So again, there's a whole lot of leaping, whole lot of physical argy-bargy in it. I suppose I was just better at being crafty with my physical argy-bargy and hurling, which was the difference. And it's like I've written 2 books on Gaelic football, and so explaining sort of how the tactics have evolved over the years. Because it used to just be hit and hope, and now like there's a lot more smartness in terms of how you play a long ball or how you maintain possession and how you control territory. People are realizing that territory matters a lot now as well, and in terms of how you sap a team's energy. So like you might see, like I remember Dublin were playing against a county called Derry a few years ago in an All-Ireland semi-final, and that was much better than Derry normally do. And so Derry's tactic was to sit really, really deep to try and make it harder for Dublin to break through and score against them.
Yeah, just play
Dublin
defense.
kind of though. Extreme defense, like sort of super cagey. Yeah. But the problem was Dublin were very aware of this, and all they had to do was really just like stand about 50 meters away from the goal, pass it amongst themselves. Derry be running like mad to try and close them down. Dublin were using no energy, they're just kicking the ball back and forth. Eventually the defense tires out and you just run through them. And so you've got to be smart in how you do it. It's the best way to do it. It obviously requires crazy fitness. Like the part I think a lot of regular people in Ireland even don't cop is until they actually meet a player in person is how smaller a guy who looks huge in Gaelic football is than in person. Like, because we'd assume, like, we see a guy in rugby field who looks, big and muscular, and we see a muscular guy in a Gaelic football pitch. Well, they're probably the same size, and there could be like 60 pounds between them, it's like, or more, because it basically requires more of a lithe body really to get by in Gaelic football than in, say, rugby.
Aren't these two sports, hurling and Gaelic football, completely disparate in terms of skill set?
Oh yeah, wildly. But see, I suppose a lot of it comes back to sort of how people are introduced to the sport, which is why they're associated so much with it. One, it's the same governing body is huge, and like that governs like sort of handball in Ireland. I don't mean like Olympic handball like you see in Germany and Europe, which is really cool. This is also cool, but it's different. It's more of the handball you see in the US, like playing against a wall.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So that's the same governing body for that, but also rounders, which is.
Oh right.
Yeah, which I don't know if it's like the nearest comparison is baseball, but obviously, but it's like it's underarm and sort of it's far more family oriented in terms of sort of I don't mean in terms of like sort of the sport, but I mean in terms of having mixed teams is typical, and it's a much slower pace overall, like so because like people think underarm that's like softball, it's like it's nowhere near as fast as softball.
Yeah.
It's like. Because typically what you're hitting it with as well is like sort of is a much wider bat, and so that obviously reduces sort of the power coming off. So it's much more about the running than it is about sort of the ball work, if that makes sense. The fielding, and so it's so that's the same governing body for all those. And the weird part is that there are women's forms of these sports, because I know we talked about the men's. In the women's, it's called ladies Gaelic football, which everybody kind of goes grr, because obviously it was called ladies back then. We prefer to call it women's now, and it's a slow movement towards finally renaming it. Hilariously, it's the association itself, which is slow, and it is one of the most progressive feminist organizations going to be in the sport. They just really like the name, and so that's why it's slow moving. But the women's form of hurling is called camogie, and again, it's goes back to history, because the GAA back then, they were very manly men who didn't think women should be playing sport. They thought they should be in the kitchen, all that sort of horrible stuff. And so camogie was formed itself, and it still had a lot of support from people in the GAA when it got going. And that sort of evolved to being identical to hurling in format now, but it used to be a little different. It used to be like, I think it was 12 aside, and it was a much smaller field, and everybody kind of goes, this is stupid. We've got enough players now, we can just play the same sport as hurling. So there were women's versions of them, but like sort of they've come along very differently. So camogie would have a lot more history than women's Gaelic football, for example. Like they're, and so that's sort of much longer in the memory. But women's Gaelic football is way bigger than camogie now, because it's grown a lot more in like sort of a broader amount of communities. Whereas camogie always stayed more regional, where hurling was strong, is the best way to describe it.
How is women's Gaelic football? I've literally seen none of it.
It's good. It's fast. I suppose the one that annoys me is so you can't pick a ball straight off the ground in men's Gaelic football, which sounds grand, but like it's the one confusing thing when you're watching the women's game if you're only used to watching the men's game. If you've never watched either, it all makes perfect sense. By the way, nothing's going to confuse you, which I know sounds odd. It's confusing. It's sort of like if you're used to speaking, a particular sort of, regional version of a tongue, of a language, and then you hear a different region, and it's got enough differences to mess with your head, where someone learning both from the start is fine at both.
Right.
So it's basically, so there's these subtle differences. So the big difference really is that a women's sport, you can pick the ball straight up off the ground, whereas in the men's, you've got to put your foot under it, which doesn't sound that basic, but it's that slight difference in speed which is good, makes the women's sport actually better, to be honest. But it's so confusing if you've never watched it before and you're really familiar with the men's sport. And it's like, what? Because you're sort of mentally used to, and they're going to turn like this now. It's sort of, when you're seeing even a wide receiver or a tight end runs, and they're going to do that now when they bump off that guy, and then suddenly they bump a totally different way, and it makes no sense. And
right, well, it's like Canadian football versus American football.
Yeah. So that's a brilliant example, actually, comparison. So it's that, you're getting used to it, but when you get used to it, you go, oh yeah, this is cool. It's come along great. Because when I would have been, even in my late teens, it was still, my mid-teens really, it was still a very small sport because it just hadn't really grown. But they did a lot of work growing it, across other counties. And the bad news is, well, thankfully we aren't as bad as we are in the men's sport. Where Dublin is turning into an unstoppable powerhouse in that again. But Cork beat us to the punch and being the most unreal in that they won, I think it was 10 All-Irelands in 11 years, which is just insane. And so that was just crazy. It's come along a lot though, and I've seen lots of other counties develop, where it used to be just a couple of counties were good and that was that, whereas now it's sort of much more widespread, and it's great to see, to be honest.
I don't suppose that there's any agreement on the greatest of all time argument in these sports, is there?
Well, so Gaelic football, there's definitely a lot of argument over, but with hurling, it's kind of weird that there being an argument is more recent. So for most of sort of, way long time hurling has been played, people would have largely agreed Christy Ring was the best ever. He's this Cork guy played in the 40s, 50s, who went bald at a young age, so middle-aged guys could immediately appreciate him, and played with a cap. And so he was this absolute, brilliant hurler for Cork. And honestly, I think the TV age is the one thing that sort of made people debate it more, because obviously we're seeing more guys play their full prime with all the games on TV. So you got this guy Henry Shefflin from Kilkenny, who was dominant force for a long time and has the most all-stars of any player ever. Before him, there was another Kilkenny player, DJ Carey, basically the same arguments. Yeah, it's kind of, I think most people would still, it's not like sort of, say, basketball where people get, argumentative over the LeBron versus Jordan thing, where you and I both know it's Brian Scalabrine is the greatest basketball player of all time. But where it's I think most people would just basically be like, obviously, Christie's the best of all time, but it wouldn't be quite as unanimous anymore. Gaelic football is a way harder question, because I'm even trying to think, loads of people would argue, most people would immediately come up with 4 or 5 names who they would consider in the pantheon, if that makes sense. And, but I suppose some people might argue Pat Spillane, but even then, I think almost all of those would straight away go, but you got this guy, this guy, this guy. Pat Spillane was a Kerry player in the 70s and 80s, but I'm kind of going, well, yeah, but I've seen players better than him. Another Kerry player, the best I ever saw as a player, as sort of contemporary, obviously I wasn't any good, was Colin Cooper from Kerry. And he was also brilliant. But there's a guy playing for Dublin now, Brian Fenton, who's been an extraordinary dominant force through this Dublin run. And right now he looks like the greatest of all time. But it's I suppose it helps him that it hurts him, that he's seen so much, in that he's seen in a team that's just kicking ass every day, and it's they're grinding teams to pieces, they're so good. Whereas some of those Spillane and Cooper Kerry teams did as well, but Cooper was lucky that he had more competitive, situations around him. His team had to fight for a few more of their All-Irelands than Dublin did, whereas Spillane benefited a lot from people would just read or listen to him on the radio being good, rather than actually see, because there wasn't as many games on TV back then. So, football, I'd say it's very safe to say there's no unanimous goat in Gaelic football, whereas in hurling, it's sort of it's just presumed it's Christy Ring, even though the vast majority of people alive today never saw him play a game in their lives.
This sounds like a lot of other sport. Cricket has this situation. Baseball has this situation. If you're going with Babe Ruth as the greatest of all time, it's going to get to the point where nobody's was alive at the time Babe Ruth was alive.
Oh yeah. Point. And I suppose cricket's always benefited from having crazy amount of baseball to a degree as well. Stats, yeah, they're both so stat heavy, they can at least lean on that a bit. Right. If you think of American football as you call, as I'd call it, football where you are, the sport's totally different to what it was. And that's including the size of the bodies, You know, like I've always gone for like, you know, best in the world at what you do is what I prefer to go with, because I suppose in Ireland the bigger debate is really who's our best athlete of all time, and that comes down to a soccer player or a runner or a boxer type thing. And I'm like, I don't really care. I just care if they're the best at what they do, like, you know, which I know makes me less fun in a pub, but you know, it's like I don't get too wound up over it. Like, to me, the greatest of all time thing, it's like it's a bit of crack, but if you take it too seriously, like, enjoy the greatest of your time if you can, is what I always say for sure. Because, you know, as a boxing fan, I've watched a lot of, you know, historical fights. One of the great defenders of Lennox Lewis, because people go, oh, but who did he beat? Because, yeah, but did you see how he beat them? You know, it's
right.
Like, you know, it's like, that's why, like, you know, it's like Lewis is like, oh, it's like one of the great underrated heavyweights, because he was so good, no one could live with him. That was the problem. But like, to me, the more fun question in LeBron versus Jordan is more how the two of them would be different as players if they played in each other's era.
Yeah.
Like, that to me would be fascinating to see. Yeah. Like, you know, if you could find a way to do that. Because like, I still think Jordan's like, you know, in conversation for greatest of all time if he's playing in the current era. But I also think he looks nothing like the Michael Jordan we watched.
Well, there's this tremendous stat where they showed when Harden averaged 35 points a game. So they threw up this stat during a game where it was like, here's the last three guys to score 35 points. And it was Jordan. And it had 3-point attempts, 1. Kobe Bryant, 3-point attempts, 7.5. James Harden, 3-point attempts, 13 per game, right? Imagine Jordan taking like 9 or 10 3-point attempts a game. He would have averaged, what, like 40? No hand checks? He'd be awesome.
Because like how fouls are being called now versus then as well.
Right.
But again, you kind of go, well, does that mean LeBron would be worse? I go, well, hang on, LeBron's a pretty physically tough guy. He might actually been better in an era where fouls weren't called as much, because he could have, you know, thrown himself around a bit more. Like, then he's had to play within that element of his physicality. Like, you know, I think it goes both ways. Like, you know, I think LeBron, if like he wasn't shooting threes, like was basically told destroy the lane and you will not be called for an offensive foul in your life. I think that would have been quite a terrifying sight.
Oh yeah, in the early 80s when the Lakers and the Celtics are just doing these track beats and it's 130 to 127, LeBron would have been awesome. Get out of his way.
Oh yeah, well, I think the best guys will find, and the best players, because I'm saying that's the best players will find a way to adapt to whatever era they're in, because it's not just like, you know, how good they are, their time that makes them great. It's like that, you know, ability to compete and, you know, how they build their skills around that ability to compete that matters.
Right. A lot of these sports, especially if you're talking about something like baseball, have these very obscure skills that are required. Yeah. And that's going to translate. You know, I mean, Ted Williams supposedly could see the stitches on the ball. Well, he could see the stitches on the ball in 2020. We'll get back to the Truly the Goats podcast in just a moment. But first, I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so what can you tell me about Teddy McCarthy and Danny Wall, who won championships in both sports for Cork in 1990?
Much more about Teddy than Walt, I gotta say. So Teddy McCarthy was like, and he's like one of the last great dual players. Like, there were a few guys who did dual after, which is basically playing both sports at the same time. And the schedule required, because remember, all these people have jobs. That's a key thing to bear in mind. They all have jobs. And so you're trying to manage inter-county training and club training in some cases, although during the inter-county training season, people assume you're not going to be seeing that club stuff too much, you know? They have to like fit both those in. And as the sports have become more and more professionalized, despite the players being amateur, you don't really see anyone play both sports for their county anymore that much at all, sadly. But Teddy's one of the last greats. But yeah, it was... So Teddy like played in both finals. I think Danny might have been a sub in one if he Walsh, but I'm not entirely sure. He might have even gotten on the field in either now that I think about it. But he was like sort of best known for oddly a piece where there's this great bit of commentary, which you got to look up the actual text to get it correct, about Teddy McCarthy. One of our great commentators, Michal Murhertig, did about him. And it's just this, he was like, great player in both sports, which again, very hard to do because he just maintained the schedule to do that. He was playing with a guy called Mick McCarthy. McCarthy is a common name in Cork, so this is a brilliant bit of commentary. Teddy McCarthy to Mick McCarthy, no relation. Mick McCarthy back to Teddy McCarthy, still no relation. The stopwatch has stopped. It's up to God and the referee now. The referee is Pat Horan. God is God.
Nice.
And it's like, because the odd thing, so while you do get a lot of people with similar names who play in the same teams, you do get crazy amount of siblings in sides as well. So it actually is worth pointing out often, even though people go, sure, there's so many McCarthys in Cork, a person might go, that's easy. It's like, well, yeah, but the thing is, if they are siblings, you must know as well. So it's like, and there's a lot of siblings who end up being good at inter-county level. But yeah, so that, like 30 years ago, it shows the context. It was 31 years ago that Cork did the double. And it's rare for a county to be good at both at the same time. We've had like Cork got to the final in both in 2000, won the hurling, lost the football. I don't think any county's been in the final in both since. The furthest any county's been, has gotten both teams to a semi-final at the same time, is I think the best anyone's done since then. Which is, says a lot because it's only 32 counties in the country, and when you reduce that to the hurling counties, there's really only 8 to 10 at one time. So long as if they're good at hurling, if their football team is good at the same time, it's a good sign. But it's only been done like 4 times in history, twice by Cork, twice Tipperary, and the one Cork did in the 90s was in 1990. I think it was like 6 decades after the last one before that, if not longer, so it's largely seen as this unattainable goal to win both the hurling and football title in the same year.
Is this just kind of the effect again that we see in so many sports where it demands your attention 12 months a year?
If you're a top level player, it largely does. I think we're lucky in the way sports are so seasonal over here. Actually, first, America is very seasonal in how it does the sports. Yeah. But the commitment in terms of there is not much of an off season, because especially with the club aspect I've mentioned so much. If you're playing at a county, basically your club season starts 2 weeks after. As in, your club has been playing matches the whole time, but they've been lower level competitions. But your club serious games start basically 2 weeks after your competition in the inter-county ends. That's another brutal slog to try and win the county title, which is a big deal for your community. And then if you win your county title, you try and win your provincial title for clubs. And then there's an All-Ireland title for clubs as well. So, if you're a player at a high level, and you might often say stay playing dual at club while playing inter-county at one, you will comfortably have a 12-month year doing it. And it's probably why you see players retire so young these days. Most guys, once they hit 30, 31, they're giving serious thought to saying, yeah, I'm done, lads. You'll have the odd player who'll last at 35, but that's exceedingly rare these days.
Yeah, you see this in rugby, you see this in NFL football. These guys will just hang it up at age 30.
Well, I hope I haven't confused your listeners too much, as the one thing, we've gone on a bit of a journey here.
No, this is great. This is great, man.
Well, see, it's great for us because we both love lots of sports.
Yeah, just
it's I'm thinking, it's these guys have gone everywhere. Yeah, we have. Well, I'll leave you on this one because I was chatting to a guy who's English who lives in Ireland for his podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I was saying, yeah, it's I know there's lots of historical reasons behind it, but it always amazes me that these islands, both the British and the Irish, didn't think indoor sports were the ones to just focus on, given how much it rains.
Excellent. Okay, well, Emmet Ryan, thanks very much for joining us. Truly the Goats.
Thanks for having me, Oz. Great talking to you again, man.
This has been a special edition of Truly the Goats. To find us online, visit trulythegoats.com. On Twitter and Facebook, we're at Truly the Goats. For more like-minded shows, be sure to check out sportshistorynetwork.com. Like the man says, it's
your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport.
Thanks to our guest for Truly the Goats episode 12. And, as it turned out, episode 13, sportswriter and journalist Emmet Ryan. The Truly the Goats theme song is Fun on Street, greatest street mix of all time, and is produced by David Liso of Dynamo Stairs. This is Oz Davis for Truly the Goats and the Sports History Network saying, Brian Scalabrine rules. And reminding you, keep on keeping that perspective.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings you sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorum Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.